Hello, welcome everybody. I am Vivian Schiller. I am the Executive Director of Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. Thank you for joining us for Disinfo Discussions. This is our series exploring the various angles of the mis and disinformation crisis. We're doing the series in conjunction with the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. Today, I am super lucky to be speaking with Julia Angwin. She is the award-winning investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of the Markup, which is a nonprofit newsroom that investigates the impacts of technology on society. She has a long and very stellar track record as an investigative journalist, including with ProPublica. She is also the author of Dragnet Nation, A Quest for Privacy, Security, and Freedom in a World of Relentless Surveillance, which is exactly the topic we're talking about today. Julia, thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Great. This has been really looking forward to this conversation. Privacy is a really complicated topic, especially when it intersects with technology. So you've, again, been reporting on this for probably longer than you would care to admit. So can you let's just start with sort of a brief, 50,000-foot overview of the landscape of digital privacy and how it's evolved over, say, the last 20 years, just at a high level.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, privacy is such a confusing word because it feels like we're talking about, I just want to go in my room and close my door and be alone, right? I like a Greta Garbo kind of, I want to be alone situation. But what most people are talking about today when we're talking about privacy is sort of the increasing use of technology to surveil parts of our lives that were previously not witnessable, right? So 20 years ago, when you walk down the street, or even if you browse the web, if you were able to get to an academic lab and use a computer and or send an email, you really had no expectation that anyone else was going to see any of those things happening, right? That you were going to be effectively anonymous in a lot of situations that were somewhat public. But technological advances have meant that there are cameras and other technologies sort of like that collect data about human behavior at a scale that was previously impossible. And then on top of that, you have two different trends, which is one, governments using that data to control and surveil their citizens, and also a whole new commercial data exploitation market that buys and sells personal data. And so suddenly we're in a world where our expectations of privacy and anonymity in public spaces have been heavily eroded.
So, a lot of people, when they think about privacy with regard to the devices, you often hear people saying, oh, somebody's listening to my conversation when I have my iPhone nearby. And that's why I saw an ad about shrimp, because I was talking about making shrimp for dinner tonight. But it's much, first of all, that is probably not necessarily the case, but it's really more complicated than that. It's about our behaviors and our movements around the web and the kinds of things that are being collected about us, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that is important to know is like that our human behavior is more predictable than we think. Right. And so we do things regularly and we didn't previously have them witnessed, and we're not necessarily conscious of those things. So the companies that collect and exploit personal data have built pretty sophisticated prediction models. And so they may be able to tell from your grocery orders or whatever it was you were doing that they can see online that an ad for shrimp is going to be appropriate for you. Perhaps you actually eat shrimp every Tuesday. You've just never once thought about that, right? And so sometimes these models are way smarter than we think. And then sometimes they're, of course, way dumber, right? I mean, everyone has had the experience of having the item that you just bought follow you around in an ad for 2 weeks. And you're like, dude, I already bought you, go away, So these models are, but the thing about it is ultimately these models are so pervasive. There's a whole economy around predicting human behavior that was just no longer there. And so we are the subject of just thousands of predictions all the time.
So let me put up a straw man that you've heard before, and I'll let you knock it down. Why do I care? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a drug dealer. And so I have nothing to hide. So what do I care if I'm seeing ads for things that are interesting in me? Why as Joe or Jill consumer, should I be concerned about this?
Yeah, the why should I care? I've done nothing wrong argument is always the argument that's lobbied against people who are concerned about the data exploitation market. And the truth is that the answer is twofold. One is that you have done something wrong. So like, it's actually,
how did you know?
It's illegal, for instance, to eat crustaceans of a certain size. They're too, like you can't catch lobsters above a certain pound or whatever. There are actually a lot of laws that you are not aware of. And so, one of the things that we rely on in society is that although there are a lot of laws, they're not all enforced, right? Jaywalking, there are many rules that are discretionarily enforced. And the thing is, as we know from our policing environment, those laws are often enforced against the most vulnerable communities, right? People of color, poor people are often the ones who bear the brunt of really prosecutorial discretion. And so when we talk about, I haven't done anything wrong, what we really mean is, I'm in a group of people privileged enough to not be subject to prosecutorial discretion, right? And so that is, I think, step one. The other thing about not having done anything wrong is that what people sort of fail to recognize is that this type of data is used has been used historically in really quite terrible ways, right? No Muslims had particularly done anything wrong after 9/11, but the FBI did go to the Census Bureau and illegally obtain lists of where every Muslim lived and then heavily surveil them for a decade, causing a lot of trauma and false accusations in that community. And so data about groups of people has and always will be abused by powerful people. And so it's incumbent upon us as citizens to constantly rein in those authorities and prevent them from abusing their powers.
Right. So there's a body of evidence that's being collected about us every minute of the day that could come into play depending on the circumstances, as you point out, particularly for vulnerable communities. Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit about, help me connect the dots between this data collection, privacy concerns, and mis and disinformation. What do the two issues have to do with each other?
Yeah, such a good question, right? Because they don't seem immediately related, right? And yet they sort of intuitively are related. And so I'm going to come at it from two different ways. One is when I wrote my book, Dragnet Nation, in 2010, what I did was an experiment. I tried every possible way to get out of what I call dragnet surveillance, meaning, broad swaths of surveillance. The point being, I wasn't trying to evade, like if the FBI was actually chasing me, I wasn't trying to take criminal evasion measures. I was just trying to get out of
the record,
the indiscriminate tracking that is, everywhere. And so I did all sorts of things like getting a burner phone and fake identities and different types of accounts. And what I found was that I was really engaging in quite a bit of disinformation, right? Like the world of relentless surveillance has actually forced individuals to try to protect their privacy through misdirection, obfuscation, because you can't actually avoid being seen. And so you have to change how you're being seen, right? I learned these techniques from my teenager. She has, like every teenager, multiple Instagrams, and they're all called Finstas, my fake Instas, right? You have like 6 Finstas. And you have different ones for different groups of friends, and you have different personas in each one. And this is literally a coping technique for a world of relentless surveillance. So it's worth noting that the world of surveillance creates a need and a requirement for everyone to engage in a bit of disinformation, right? So you already have set the standard for like a level of disinformation that we haven't seen before. And then you basically have to look at the fact that digital technology has allowed the creation of propaganda on mass scale. So the truth is that in the past, governments were really the only ones who could afford to do really aggressive propaganda. You know, the US used to fly over other countries and drop leaflets, right? Promoting democracy, like from a plane, little pieces of paper would rain down. Now, of course, anyone can make propaganda. And so it's become a bit of an industry. And the thing is that you need to know who to distribute your propaganda to. And that's where the data exploitation market comes in. Though you can find vulnerable people because you can buy lists of them. Honestly, that's what the data exploitation market is. There's a word they used to use when there were mailing lists, and people just used to send junk mail. There were lists called sucker lists, and it was like, these are the people who are going to fall for your scam. Now, of course, you can buy any kind of sucker list. You're going to get the sucker lists of people on Facebook or the people on Instagram. And so those are people who can distribute propaganda to. And so it suddenly makes disinformation and lies weaponized, honestly, because they can be sent directly to the people who are most vulnerable to receive them. And because of the weird world we live in, no one else really knows that they're getting those lies, right? Because everyone is seeing a different feed and a different worldview because the news is being filtered and tailored to them. So we're in a very weird world where there's a baseline level of disinformation that everyone has been sort of taught to engage in, and then there's a way to weaponize it to vulnerable communities.
You don't even need to buy a sucker list though, right? You can just buy an ad on Facebook, and the targeting that you can choose which, demographic, psychographic information you want and target people in that way, right? Isn't that even
yeah, no, that's my point. You used to have to buy a sucker list. Now Facebook it's a drop-down menu for the sucker list, right? So I mean, we wrote a story at the Markup last year that Facebook had an ad targeting category called interested in pseudoscience. It was literally a suckers list. Like, you could buy ads targeted to people who were obviously interested in fake science, and then people were using that to sell like literally tinfoil hats, right?
and that that category of people who are included in the interested in pseudoscience, that is not people that raised their hand and said, hey, sign me up for this list,
No.
right? That was extracted. Explain how that list comes to be. It's extracted by their behavior, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. We don't really know how Facebook decided that there were 78 million people interested in pseudoscience. It's maybe they clicked on something. I mean, they track what you do on Facebook, but they also track what you do across the web and on your phone. And so they could have found that inference anywhere, and there's really no accountability for it, right? Honestly, if they're wrong, it doesn't really matter. So they have an interest in sort of like over categorizing people in the hopes of giving advertisers what they want. And so we don't know what they did. I mean, the reason we found it is one of our reporters was targeted by this category. So the ad he saw for a sort of radiation protecting hat said, we think you're interested in pseudoscience. And he's like, what did I do to deserve this? Right? Like, he has no idea.
That's incredible. So, okay, so we've got, so our behaviors, not just on Facebook, but our behaviors across the web collected. We are grouped. All of us are grouped into some kind of demographic categories through mysterious means that are a black box, and we are served information that we believe might be attractive to us. So your point being that there are tens and if not hundreds of millions of people who might be susceptible to mis and disinformation. Okay, so what do we do about it? How can we, there's been, I know that if I go into the terms of service or I go deep into the bowels of my Facebook or YouTube account, I can find ways to change my access. What remedies are available in these services? And then I want to move and talk a little bit about what other sort of policy or legislative remedies might be available. But let's start with sort of what the platforms are offering today.
Yeah, I mean, most of the platforms offer you what I call an illusion of control, right? So you go into some sort of privacy menu, and there's a million knobs and dials, and you could turn all these knobs and dials. The studies have shown that the more knobs and dials there are, the more you feel you're in control. And so, and actually that you are more willing to accept privacy violations, the more knobs and dials there are. So they offer you these very confusing settings, and you move them around and you think, oh, I've really solved this. And the truth is, not really, you haven't. The most that they really promise you is that like you might see a thing in there that says, we think you're interested in pseudoscience. So you can remove that. That doesn't mean that tomorrow it won't pop up again, right? They will recategorize you. Their algorithms are constantly running on top of your behavior and categorizing you. All you can kind of do is retroactively occasionally get a glimpse into those predictions. And we don't know whether they show you all of them, right? We just know they show you some, and then you can maybe turn some of them off. Of course, there are moves like Apple's iPhone where they're becoming more aggressive about limiting tracking, right? And so Apple has come out with this new setting where you can turn off all tracking. So places like Facebook were able to track you, not just in the app, but actually other things you did across the phone. Apple has basically made the default that that's no longer the case. However, at the very same time, Apple launched its own ad business that is going to be tracking you. And so it's not entirely clear that they just haven't substituted one tracking for another. So I think that ultimately the reason I did this experiment where I did this 1 year of trying to opt out of tracking in my book, Dark Night Nation, was actually to determine, is it possible to individually control this? And my conclusion was no. Honestly, as an individual, you have very little control because we need to use these technologies to engage in our lives. And so ultimately, your ability to decline participation in the data exploitation market is pretty minimal. And so I would say all you can do is kind of minimize around the margins, but not really opt out entirely.
So there's appears to be growing awareness and maybe with the Biden administration, a greater interest and willingness to take aggressive action. What remedies are on the table that you find promising? What are your recommendations for how of how to sort of put this genie back in the bottle, if that's possible at all?
I mean, I'm not sure I have entirely recommendations, but I would say that I have a few thoughts. One thing that I think is really important to think about is whether the benefits of micro-targeting really outweigh the risks, right? The idea of categorizing all human behavior and then allowing commercial interests to use those to target individuals and to identify individuals, are the risks to society higher than the benefits to advertisers, right? Because truthfully, the idea that the Russians could come in, which literally happened in 2016, bought ads to target vulnerable people to convince them A, to not vote, or B, to vote for Trump. Is that risk worth it just to be able to have the right sneakers follow you around? It's just not clear. And I think that's one thing that's sort of interesting about the European approach is they are actually considering that question, whether micro-targeting is actually just not good for society. And I think that's a question that hadn't come up before because, previously, and I would say the reason I think that's a really important question is because that's actually also why journalism is declining, right? Journalism is the watchdog of democracy, and it is financially in extremely deep trouble in the US and around the world. And one large part of that is the inability to sell their audience, right? Previously, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal for 14 years, the way they made all their money was that if you wanted to reach a middle manager who golfed on the weekends, drove a BMW, you basically had to buy one of these several $100,000 full page ads in the Wall Street Journal. That was how you got that guy. And so they had kind of a monopoly on a high-end audience, and that allowed them to produce high-end journalism. You can no longer sell your audience that way, right? Journalism does not actually have any incentive to sell a quality audience because the ad tracking industry means that the best way to catch that BMW guy is go to an ad network like Google or Facebook and find that guy based on his behavior on the internet, for pennies, right? And you'll find him on some very low quality website. You don't need to pay a Wall Street Journal premium. So there's actually an argument that targeting has A, destroyed journalism, and B, kind of messed up our political discourse. And it's this important question to think about whether we're willing to live with those outcomes.
But you've got some pretty powerful forces on the other side. First of all, if I'm BMW, this is like the greatest era in marketing history, because if I'm buying an ad in the Wall Street Journal, yeah, I'm going to reach some of the people I want, but I don't really know. It's very difficult to measure. I'm pretty blind. Whereas if I can select the specific exact kind of person that I know from my research is inclined to buy a BMW, the efficiency is incredible. And also what you're talking about is this is what you're describing is the fundamental business model for Facebook and Google. I mean, that is the business model.
Yeah, I mean, I'm raising a provocative question, that no question, but I'm just saying we have to understand the costs of that. That's totally fine. It's created a great industry. It's created efficiency in advertising. It happens to be destroying the free press and really harming our political discourse. I don't know. I'm just saying these are the trade-offs.
And by the way, I'm not taking a side here. I'm just pointing out that that there's, the fact that these models are so successful is not an accident. They are incredibly efficient, despite the fact that they're harming democracy and destroying the free press. Okay, let's like I said, let's come back to sort of legislation and regulation. What do you see? And Europe has been sort of out in front on this. What do you see in terms of what's working around privacy legislation in Europe or elsewhere that might be adopted in the United States or should be adopted in the United States?
I mean, I guess I hate to be this person, but I will like flip it and tell you what's not working. So, I mean, I think anyone who's been confronted with the accept all cookies on this website pop-up has succumbed. Like there's, they make it so hard for you to turn off those things. And so I would say that requiring opt-in is actually not working, right? We're pushing this decision on privacy down to the individual, means that it actually forces people to accept things that they wouldn't otherwise accept. It's sort of like if you got in a car and it said, you have to press 20 buttons and wait 5 minutes to start the car if you want to use a seatbelt, right? No one would use seatbelts, right? And so that's essentially what is happening here, right? Like protecting your data is a seatbelt of some kind. It's a safety measure, but they're making it really difficult. And so I think it's worth noting that the European model, although has some good aspects to it, that particular piece of it has actually led to, I think, worse outcomes, which is this idea that everyone's given up. They're like, oh, well, it's just too hard, right? They've made it too hard to protect your data. A better way to protect data is to say, hey, you know what? There are certain data you can't use. You can't use health data. You can't use kids' data. You can't use, like, there's just got to be things that can't be used, race, right? And so like that would be maybe a better way to look at limits than forcing individuals to make choices that they aren't actually equipped to make.
Yeah. And do you see that working anywhere?
There are some limits on data. Like the US has decent sectoral laws on children's and health data, but both of them are really porous. And so they're easy to get around. And so one of the things that I think is a decent movement is this idea of setting a baseline standard for privacy that isn't entirely just rules in certain sectors, because those sectors are very narrowly defined in the law, and then it ends up that people figure out a way to get around them. So what's happening right now is the US is really unique in not having a baseline standard of like, you simply just can't do X, Y, and Z things. And so there's a huge debate playing out right now in the US. California passed a really strong baseline standard privacy law. The tech companies are going to all the other states trying to write weaker laws and getting those passed. And then they're going to go to DC and demand harmonization to the weaker standard, right? So this is a very important debate that's playing out right now. We will get a federal privacy standard, and the question is, will it be strong or weak? And that is being played out in state legislatures where, honestly, the tech money is can just buy out a state, right? We wrote a story where we talked to the lawmakers in Connecticut. They had written really strong privacy law. And the tech companies came in and they bought every single lobbyist in the state capitol. So the lawmakers went in to talk about the bill, and the guy was quoted saying, look, I saw every single lawmaker had been bought out by the tech companies, and I was facing, and it was and we looked at the records, it cost $600,000 to buy out the entire state, right? This is nothing for those companies. That bill was defeated. A new bill came through that the tech companies had written, and that is going to pass, right? And that's how the game is being played. And so it's sad because these states they can't compete against the money that is being put up here.
And what was lost? Like what provisions that were in the original stronger version of the bill were struck?
One of the most important things is the ability for liability, right? So the things the companies don't want is any liability for bad behavior. So whenever these bills include a private right of action, they go completely ballistic and to the wall. And you could have a debate about whether private right of action is the right.
What is private? Explain what private right of action.
Private right of action means that you can get together a class of people and sue, saying like not only like, because normally if something, if the companies break the law, they would normally sort of negotiate with the Federal Trade Commission or the enforcement, the state AG, and settle, right? Or there would be a consent decree and they would agree to change their behavior, right? That's what the penalty would be for breaking the law. Private right of action means that like citizens could sue the companies and say, you know, I basically a personal injury type thing, right? Like we were all damaged by this behavior, and that adds more liability to the companies. And I think they can negotiate with the states better than they can in court with individuals. And so that is the thing that the companies are torpedoing in every state.
Yeah. Any other big provisions? It's just really interesting to hear what are the real hot buttons.
Well, opt-in and opt-out is the other thing, which is interesting because a lot of these laws like California are saying basically you can either you have to get people to opt in, which is actually the European model that I'm saying actually is a bit flawed. California is taking a really interesting approach, which is a global opt-out, meaning that you only have to click one button once to opt out of all sites, and so that you don't have to be greeted with that pop-up on every site. And to me, that's actually a really clever compromise, because the truth is that the opt-in model I feel like hasn't been shown to be that successful, because there's easy ways to force everybody to opt in, but a global opt-out where you say once, no more, and then it's all gone, right? And that opt-out actually includes do not sell my information, right? It's not just don't track me. It's like you literally can't trade this information. And that's a pretty big provision. And so the companies are really against that global opt-out.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people, you know, that sees that pop-up, you know, 30 times a day. I'm like, oh, fine. Yes. I just want to read my article.
I mean, are you kidding? Me too. And I literally wrote a book about this. I'm like the person who tries the hardest, right? And it's impossible.
Too much. So we're coming towards the end of our time. This has really been a great conversation. I have just one more for you. We're asking everybody. So you know, this is we're running this series in conjunction with our Commission on Information Disorder. These are certainly intended to inform the general public, but they're also for our commissioners. Is there anything related to privacy as specifically relates to mis and disinformation that you think the commissioners should know as they prioritize sort of issues and solutions? The idea is we're going to be coming out with both priorities and solutions aimed at government, at the federal, state, and local level, the private sector, and civil society. What's the most important things here they should be thinking about or know or do?
I think that given the history of both misinformation and privacy, that the commissioner should really keep in mind the fact that the data exploitation market makes it so easy to identify and honestly oppress already vulnerable groups. And so the use of micro-targeting to distribute disinformation to people who are already vulnerable is something that I think is really important to figure out a way to mitigate those risks.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Julia. Julia Angwin, thank you so much for shining a light for us on all of these issues. It can be pretty confusing, but you unpacked it all for us beautifully. So thank you so much. And
thank you. This was fun.
yeah, great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.